Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbites. Joining me today in studio is Ben Kinsley, my co-host.
You wouldn't know that.
Yes, but actually he's my guest today. Welcome.
Thank you.
You've been on this show not for a while.
I know, been busy.
It's been a while, yes you are. He's up in the legislature a lot, and today he was testifying in House Education about a proposal that Campaign for Vermont put together and submitted to them, and they asked Ben to come in and talk about it. And just for, what's the word they use, transparency, I also work for Campaign for Vermont, almost said something different, Vote for Vermont. And Vote for Vermont is actually part of Campaign for Vermont. And so while this is Ben's proposal, I'm signed off on it, so there you go.
Yes.
So for folks listening, can you bring us up to date about just when we submitted our proposal, what was going on?
Yeah, so this is the second round of school governance reform discussions that we've had in the last number of years. I was involved in the first round back in 2014, 2015, that led to Act 46 and the consolidations under that piece of legislation. And then, of course, because Act 46 didn't really solve anything, we are back here 10 years later looking at the same problems. We have escalating costs, we have shrinking student populations, and we have a new one this time around, which is declining student performance.
Right, that's the most concerning.
And that is, all of them are concerning, but we're very concerned about that. So the governor last year, at the beginning of the 2025 legislative session, introduced a proposal for 5 statewide school districts. This is something that the Secretary of Education introduced, rolled out over a series of weeks, and then the legislature reacted to it. And the legislature decided, no, 5 is not the right number. We're not going to go that far. And these would be massive districts, by the way. Much larger than any geopolitical structure we have in the state right now. So we decided, or the legislature decided, to enact Act 73, which was a consolidation bill to some degree, but it contemplated the use of school districts and supervisory unions or some combination of them. The Act 73 task force was created from that legislation and looked at what the recombining of some of those governance structures might look like. That task force looked at the research that's available nationally and came to the conclusion that there's not really a whole lot of data to support the notion that larger school districts are more efficient. The way I like to say it is, bigger is not necessarily better. Better is better.
There you go.
So that's essentially the conclusion that the redistricting task force came to. They put forward an alternative to what the legislature had originally envisioned under Act 73. Of course, the governor immediately rejected it. Some legislative leaders rejected it, others are open to it, and now the legislature is trying to figure out what to do with that. And so this is where the work we've been doing comes in, and how we're trying to address that. And it goes back to work we started, in 2014, 2013.
And I think what happened with the 2 efforts before, the public, us, Vermonters, thought there would be cost savings. And when you read the bills, there's actually no hint that maybe we should be saving money while we're doing whatever. And that's just a failing, I think, because when it all settled down, we were spending more. Pretty much. I mean, that was kind of defeating the purpose. And I think people agreed to mergers when they didn't really want to, for the sake of saving money.
Yeah,
And it
because
didn't
they were
happen.
promised savings, and that's how Act 46 was sold, right?
Yep, right.
Act
Oh, I
46
remember.
was sold as cost savings. It's interesting though because I was in the room for a lot of those discussions, and the way it evolved was it started out as, okay, we need to do something about costs,
Right.
cost drivers, spending, all of this stuff. We need to do something about reducing how much education is costing Vermont taxpayers. So that's how it started out. But as they dug into it, as they started doing work on it, looking at where are the cost savings actually going to come from, then the conclusion they came to by the time they actually voted the bill out of committee was that this is not going to save money. What it actually is it's going to bend the cost curve, meaning it's going to help us prevent spending more
Going
money
forward,
in the
right.
future, and there is going to be increased opportunities for kids. Right, those are the two things that by the time that the committees were done working on the bill, that's what they said it was going to do.
So they've pretty much said no to the governor's proposal.
Well, so it was
Or is
interesting.
it still on the table?
So that was in 2014.
Yep.
Right. And now we fast forward to 2026, and we're having the same conversations. And it's very interesting, and I think telling, that the House Education Committee, the chair of the House Education Committee, which is the committee that I testified in today, said earlier this week that the consolidation plan that they have on the table right now is not going to generate cost savings. It's not going to generate cost savings. It is going to bend the cost curve, which is exactly the same thing that the chair of that committee, same committee, said in 2014. Different chairs, not the same person, but exactly the same thing, that the conclusion that the committee came to, and they've come to the same conclusion this time around with school district consolidation.
Well, they didn't ask a ton of questions, but they really got it, what you were trying to say. I know there was a big discussion between the difference between a supervisory unit and an ESA. That was a discussion.
Yes.
Maybe you could talk about what that meant. That was quite an interesting, and I don't think they could get it out of their minds that you were trying to have them revise
the way they think about it.
But they were stuck on it.
Yeah, and this has been an inherent challenge in the terms of how we talk about education reform. So to back up to how we arrived at where Campaign for Vermont is today from a policy perspective, we looked at all of the education data in our system and did what's called a regression analysis, which is you take different variables and you run this, what's called a regression analysis on them, two different variables, and it tells you essentially how interrelated those two variables are. So when one changes, is there a similar correlated effect on another variable? So you can measure two at a time,
Right.
and then you can measure them against each other. Now, correlation is not causation, so you have to be careful when you what variables you actually compare against each other. But we compared cost per student. So we took a cost per student and we looked at the size of the school district and said, okay, how are these two variables related to each other? And when we looked at those, we discovered there's actually no statistical significant correlation between the two. So that means that there are small school districts that are high spending, there are small school districts that are low spending. There are large school districts that are high spending, there are large school districts that are low spending. There is not a uniform experience that can tell us that larger districts inherently spend less money. So that is a core finding. We found that in 2014, before Act 46. We reran that analysis in 2024 to see if anything had changed. And what we found is that nothing had changed. Those are still the core components, like larger school districts do not perform better on a cost basis or an efficiency basis or student outcomes. That's another variable that we looked at. Does larger mean better outcomes for students? Looking at standardized test scores and there's no correlation there either.
Right.
So what did that leave us? One of the things we did differently in 2024 is we looked at, okay, let's forget about districts for the moment, because that's where we were looking. Right. Let's go up to the supervisory union level. Right. Let's see if there's any sort of relationship we can find there, and we found one. So there is, at the supervisory union level, a 16% of the variation in supervisory union spending on a cost per student basis can be explained by the size of the supervisory union. So the bigger the supervisory union, the more efficient on a cost per student basis. So that said, okay, well, where we need to look is at the SU level. Why is this relationship? Why does this relationship exist at the SU level when it doesn't exist at the district level? So this is a data-informed policy decision, right? Like why are we seeing this relationship here but not here? So we started looking around the country at what do other states, what do they do with supervisory unions? And are our supervisory unions structured differently? Are they at a different level of scale?
And there's 52 supervisory unions,
yes.
But just from a scale perspective,
yes.
There's 52 in Vermont.
Yes.
It's a lot for a small state.
It's a lot for a small state, and this is what we found. We found that what other states, there's a generic term for them. No other states call them supervisory unions. Other states call them a variety of things, but the generic term that the National Center for Education Statistics uses to describe these entities that sit above school districts but below the State Department of Education, they're called Education Service Agencies, or ESAs. Next door in New York, they're called BOCES. In Maine, they're called Regional Supervisory Districts. In Pennsylvania, they're called intermediate units. Other places, they're just called ESAs or regional ESAs, or the task force, the Act 73 task force called them cooperative ESAs, CESAs. Terminology aside, they're all essentially the same thing. And so we looked at, how do Vermonts compare to other states? And there are some key differences. One is governance. So we attach the superintendent to the supervisory union in Vermont. That's not something that most other places do.
Yeah, I was wondering that. Where does that responsibility fall?
Yeah.
It sounds like their supervisory units, whatever they call them, are just mostly administrative, like running a side business of
So the superintendent in most other places is attached to the school district.
Yeah.
Because you're going to have, in most cases, multiple schools or principals underneath that school district. And so the superintendent is essentially the chief executive for the school district and the school board. That's usually where the superintendent is attached nationally. There's an argument, though, in Vermont, some kind of one of the reasons why supervisory unions evolved is because a school district didn't need a full-time chief executive. So supervisory unions were a way to share that chief executive functionality between a group of school boards. Along the way, we added special education to that, and then there's a bunch of other things that individual supervisory unions do, but not a statewide coordinated way. So when we looked at that, we're like, okay, governance is certainly a difference between how we operate our supervisory unions, our ESAs. The range of services is quite different. So again, there's really only, in statute, there's only really 3 services. It's curriculum, chief executive, superintendent, and special education. So the range of services is much different. In other states, ESAs provide CTE, they provide transportation, they provide professional development, they provide business services like payroll, benefit administration, purchasing, IT,
labor negotiations.
Labor negotiations, legal review. We have legal teams at that level. So like, there's a whole range of dozens of services that other ESAs provide that are not necessarily being provided.
So in your research with what the services they provide, did you find a lot of human services? How do you say it? Human services services? Do they do a lot of that? I was always under the impression that there was quite a bit of human services activity in a school where they've taken over what might be done through the general fund.
Yeah, that's certainly a claim that the teachers union has made, is that there's a lot of human services work being done in schools. Schools and teachers are being asked to do things that they weren't being asked to do decades ago. I think there's some truth to that. But I've never gotten an answer in terms of, okay, well, which services specifically? And that has not shown up in the ESA research either, of like, these are social services, not education services that are being provided. So we're still kind of hunting for where those social services are and where that social service or mental health spending might be in the system. So, but in any event, whatever service they're providing, the Vermont supervisory unions are not providing the range of services. And the third thing is they're not at scale. Like, the scale is much different. So you mentioned we have 52 supervisory unions today that serve 119 school districts. Well, math tells you that's like 2.3 districts per SU. That is not super efficient.
No.
And so going to a lesser number will absolutely be more efficient, and is more in line with what we see in other states. So, other states, you could have several school districts that are all part of that shared services from the ESA, and you're getting scale from that. We're not getting scale from that, which is part of why we're seeing that statistical relationship at the SU level that we're not seeing at the district level.
And there's a lot of money being spent at the SU level.
Yeah.
Which we've known for years that that's an issue.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's where the money is, and so the thing to come back to is, I think, what we would propose based on that finding is, okay, let's take our existing 52 supervisory unions, let's convert those into, or consolidate them, or however you want to think about them, wipe the slate clean and start over. The effect is the same, but go from 52 SUs to a smaller number of ESAs that have the full range of services, that have enough scale to actually achieve savings. And the way we chose to organize those was around career and technical education centers. So there are 17 of those, but there's 15 tech center regions, which are kind of like service areas for those tech centers. So these are all like, basically all of the member districts, or the districts that are underneath that region, they are all sending kids up to that tech center. The reason we like that is, one, it creates vertical integration between our pre-K through 12 education system and our career and technical education workforce pipeline and our post-secondary career opportunities. Right now, CTE feels very siloed in our education delivery system, and so this would help to remove that silo. If literally our whole organizational structure is organized around tech centers.
Yeah, and I know you and I have discussed this, that there's a lot of businesses who desperately need workers with the tech ed skills. Particularly our construction firms, which there are quite a few of them, that they just want somebody to come and they'll train, but they need some basic understanding of protractors or whatever. And apparently that doesn't happen as much as they would like.
Yeah, and one of the things that could happen is, again, if the ESA becomes a service provider for CTE, then, one of the things that's been talked about is trying to get exposure to CTE
Right.
down into lower grade levels, like middle school.
Perfect.
Right? So you have some exposure even before you get to the high school level of CTE programming. And again, like if you have CTE at the ESA level and that ESA is providing special education services and other things that are in the school building,
Right.
it's not reasonable or not unreasonable to think that you could have some CTE programming on site, whether it's a middle school or a high school
Right.
that does not have a CTE attached to it, but it could receive some CTE programming
Right.
because of the ESA. It's provided through the ESA, and it doesn't have to stop at CTE. It could go AP classes, it could be language classes, could be art classes, all those things that school districts are cutting today, quite honestly, because they're like, these are the frills that
Right.
yes, they're enriching opportunities, but we're under cost pressure, and this is the thing that is easiest for us to cut.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate. It's a less rich experience for students. So ESAs have the benefit of moving us towards efficiency of scale, but also potentially expanding services for
Right.
kids.
And I told you when we were actually driving to the studio that I come from BOCES.
In New York.
I never went to BOCES, but in my high school, the kids that went to BOCES would go to the regular classes with us during the morning times, whatever, English, math, so they don't have to have it duplicated at the tech center at BOCES. And then at noon, they'd all pile on the buses and go to BOCES, and so they'd spend half a day, 5 days a week at BOCES, and the rest of the time at the high school with us. So we were integrated with them, and then they had their tech center. So it was pretty well-rounded, and you don't have duplication of teachers with one in high school and one. So there's a savings right there if that's what some of them do.
Yeah, and that's the thing with like language or AP, those low volume services,
Right.
where you may only have 5 kids in one school that are going to take that
Right.
program. But if you had a teacher that was being funded at the ESA level that could move around to different
Right.
districts,
Yep.
and to provide that experience,
Yep.
that AP class, and it could be something as simple as they're going back and forth between 2 schools, so like 2 days a week they're in person, and 3 days a week they're virtual, and the
Right.
next week flip-flops. Or it could be 3 schools, and it's like again, that teacher is kind of moving around. The students are stationary, but the teacher is moving around and giving that in-classroom experience where it's possible, and then perhaps a virtual experience.
I also
where it's
wondered,
not.
when we were discussing this when I was at the Department of Education, it didn't catch on, and now after COVID, we're all so used to Zoom, and that does take a different level of experience and training for the teachers. I'll admit that, and I give them kudos for making it through
Yeah.
the COVID years. But I think people are used to virtual, and I think that would work. I don't think kids would find that strange, that they could have a teacher could teach from Rutland and still be reaching. And there could be a calendar, dare I bring that up, if the tech centers are in with
Could be
the high schools.
coordinated calendar.
Yes, we've tried that, I don't know how many years, since as far as I can remember, the one calendar has been discussed and it's never gone anywhere.
Yeah, and I do want to say, like, ESAs in other states have demonstrated track records of cost savings.
Right,
But again, they're at a different scale and a different, range of services that are
Right.
being offered. And so this is a way for us to generate cost savings. And we looked at that. So we put this forward as a model last March, and then said, okay, well, we need to follow this up with a cost savings report, because this is one of the things that has been missing from all of these conversations around around consolidation and governance and all of that, is actual, what do you think this is going to cost? What is the and what is the cost savings? What is the efficiencies? Where are the savings going to come from? So we're like, we need to back up what we're saying. Yes, there's evidence out in the field from other states that show that there's cost savings here, but what does that actually look like in
Right,
Vermont, right?
right.
So we followed that up in November with a report that estimated the cost savings. And what we did is we broke down all the different categories of spending. So there's different categories of spending that we can classify both at the SU level and the district level. So we looked at the data that's available for that, and then we looked at what the reports from other states were that found cost savings in some of those specific areas. So things like special education or bulk purchasing or accounts receivable, whatever. So we broke those down into categories, looked at what the literature said, the cost savings, potential cost savings, and we kind of then applied, and we were fairly conservative in the numbers we used, so we picked on the lower end of the scale for like what other states had experienced, but then applied those savings to the specific categories of Vermont's actual spending today in order to get a number of like, here's what we expect.
I thought the report was, we always do stuff based on data, and I think just watching the committee, I think if they go home and look at the overheads, that they'll get it.
Yeah.
They just got hung up on some of the definitions.
Yeah, there's definitely there's a lot of terminology and definitions in the education space, and they don't always mean the same thing to different people. But yeah, I think it comes back to so we applied those savings that other states had experienced to the specific spending categories in Vermont at both the SU level and the district level, and we found $333 million in savings.
There you go.
If we did that model. And so what would that mean? And then we took it a step further. This is more recently. I was like, okay, so that's a 14% reduction in spending if we went with that number. But if we apply those savings specifically to property taxes, what does it mean? Because not as much as we talk about property taxes and education, yes, that is the primary funding source for Vermont's education system, but it is not the only funding source. So if you apply those savings, $300 million in savings, to just that funding source, what does that actually mean for that funding source? And so what we did is we took it and split it between the non-homestead property tax and the homestead property tax, so 150 million plus to each.
Right.
And for the homestead property tax, what that would mean is a 21% reduction in the property taxes being paid by Vermonters if we did that. So that's pretty significant numbers.
And we're still based on property tax. We're not doing income, which was discussed at some point.
There's an income sensitivity component within the homestead property tax, and how to apply those savings. We might actually encourage applying those in such a way that middle income households get the most tax relief. And there's a way to do that because of the income sensitivity program. But just generally, we just looked at the raw number of dollars that are being paid that are going into the education fund from the homestead property tax. It is 21% less if we applied those savings. And so you can get pretty meaningful reductions in property taxes.
Which Vermonters would love. Now, there's a couple caveats to that. One is it assumes all of the savings go to that. We may want to, from a policy standpoint, reinvest some of those savings in things like school construction aid, teacher performance evaluations, accountability measures. Like there's some of those savings we may want to invest in programs like that. But if we put 100% of it towards property taxes, that's what we might be looking at. The other caveat is you're not going to see all of that in year one. It's probably going to take 2 or 3 years to get to the 100% savings mark. So you may get like 40% of the savings in year one. And then by year 3, you've got all of that. So it's not going to be necessarily all in the first year. But once you get to year 3, then you're saving that $330 million every single year. And they must have loved that. I wasn't there for that particular part of the presentation, did their eyes light up, I hope?
I think that the committee is still wrapping their heads around it. I certainly saw, this is the third time I've given a similar presentation. I gave it to the Senate Finance Committee, and I gave it to the Senate Education Committee, and now the House Education
Have
Committee
any of
today.
them talked about one contract, or have they given up on that?
I think one contract would actually potentially be too expensive, and there's two reasons for that. One, because there's going to be pressure not to cut anyone's existing contract.
Right.
So you're going to have to do...
The ceiling becomes the floor, right?
The ceiling becomes the floor. So like you have some districts that are very high compensation and others that are low compensation. And the pressure is going to be to bring the low compensation districts up to a higher level when you do a statewide contract. And this is the same problem we run into with consolidation, by the way. So this is this is the same thing we saw in Act 46, where school districts were asked to consolidate, and so if you have a group of 5 school districts that are getting together and they're like, we were asked to consolidate, no one wants to tell a group of teachers that they're going to have to take a pay cut. So what they did is they picked the most generous compensation package out of that group of 5 districts and leveled everyone up to that.
Oh, wonderful.
So that cost, under Act 46, an additional $1,500 a student.
We proposed, I proposed a couple of years ago, to do a market factor, to have all the teachers, when we look at a teacher, what is that value to us? And that would be the value of a teacher across the state. And then if you're in a district like Burlington, you get a market factor, which would bump your salary up. But then if you moved out to Berlin, where I live, you'd lose that market factor.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we've talked about, because there's no market factor built into our current system, each district sort of tries to account for that on their own, that market factor.
Right.
And what actually happens right now, because of the way the funding formula works, is that suburban districts, mostly in the outer ring of Chittenden County, where they have relatively wealthy property values, decent incomes, but decent incomes. But the problem is, those are the districts that are most penalized by the current funding formula, because they don't have a lot of poverty, they don't have a lot of kids on ELL, which is English language learning.
Yep, right.
So the funding formula is geared against that group. So, and the problem is that group also has some of the highest salary pressures, because they're in Chittenden County, they're in a suburban area. They're the median income in those areas, and the cost of living is fairly high. So there's a lot of cost pressure. And so when you look at the districts that are cutting the most right now, when I said earlier, like things like AP and language and arts, like those are the things that are being cut. They're not being cut by rural districts. They're being cut by suburban districts.
That's interesting.
So because that's where the cost pressure is, because of our current formula. So one of the things in Act 73 is the concept of a foundation formula. So in addition to the governance changes, there's a financing change. And the foundation formula would be essentially, here's a check from the state for X number of dollars per student. That per student number is going to vary based on a set of factors, including probably still ELL and special education, perhaps, and poverty and a couple other things. And so, but the thing that doesn't account for is median wages. What is your wage expectation? What is your cost of labor? And cost of labor is a huge factor when you're talking about the resource availability, because 80% of your cost in any business, any venture, including public education, 80% of your cost is personnel. So if you have a funding formula that is not factoring in your cost of labor, That's a big problem.
Yeah, right.
So when you're talking about market factor, at a minimum, the market factor should be applied to the foundation payment to the district to give them
Little boost.
the salary capacity that they need for for the labor market that they're in.
Last year or the year before last, we had to spend a lot of time on weighted factors.
Yes.
Has that finally come where we can see the impact of them? Because I know we talked about it's going to take a year or two before you actually see the impact of all of the changes in the weighting factors.
So the weighting factor is pretty clearly now, like 2 or 3 years in.
Yeah.
They're helping rural districts. They're helping urban districts that have high poverty rates or a large number of non-language learners, non-English language learners. So they're helping like the Burlingtons, the Winooskis of the world, and then the rural districts. And of course, like what I was just talking about, the districts that are getting squeezed,
Right.
who are getting hurt by that funding formula, are suburban districts that have relatively wealthy
Right.
property values. There's
Jobs.
not a ton of poverty, but they have high wage expectations, and so they're addressing that cost pressure in a couple of ways, because they're not getting the funding from the state to account for those higher salary demands, but they're also not getting the support. They're also getting like funding taken away essentially and funneled towards the urban districts
Right.
and the rural districts because of the weighting factors change. And so that is what is squeezing suburban districts.
Interesting. So
And-
what we're looking at now is the impact of the weighting factors. I need to like kind of double check that because I didn't quite understand how it was going to work.
Yeah.
It made sense when you saw what factors they applied in different areas, but
Well,
interesting to see how it sugars
it
out.
was, yeah, the intent behind it was to try to bring lower spending districts up so that there was more equity.
Right.
And it did that to some degree. But there's still a 300% difference between on a cost per student basis, 300% difference between our lowest spending and our highest spending districts. So, from our lowest spenders to our highest spenders, that 300% difference, like the foundation formula can be used to squeeze that field further, like more closer together, so there's less disparity. But we want to do it in such a way that average spending across the state, because we have a statewide education funding system, does not go up at the 5% per year, continue to go up at the 5% per year that it has for the last 25 years. Like and this is very clear, when we went to this funding formula, Act 60, we were below the national average. We were below the New England average. Once we passed Act 60, we immediately passed the national average, and within a decade, we had passed the New England average.
Right.
Since we passed Act 60, we have grown at twice the rate of the national average, and we've been there for 25 years. So if there's, the governance conversations are important, but if there's one thing we can do for long-term cost control or spending control, it's changing the funding formula. And so the foundation formula is the alternative. 40, give or take 40 other states use some variation of a foundation formula, and it's proven to be pretty effective.
Yeah.
And it's much more clear to communicate to voters too, like what's happening.
And was it Mississippi that was low, and now they're way higher than us in performance and
Yes, at a lower cost.
at a lower cost.
The-
And we can't learn from, does anybody have anything similar to what we have?
So we talked about earlier, Pat, about how there's this whole spending thing that's happening. We talked about the 5% growth in per pupil spending that we've been seeing for 25 years. And we want to compress the variation in spending from our low spenders to our high spenders, but at the same time bringing the total spending down, right? Bending that down so that it's more in line with with underlying economic growth. The whole other equation that we've talked about is how student performance has been suffering. So, and this is one of the big differences between the Act 40, like literally most of the conversations today could be copy and pasted from the Act 46 discussions.
Yeah.
Like it's literally the same terminology
Right.
that's being used, the same things that are being grappled with. Like literally, you could copy and paste these conversations. And I think the important thing that's changed is in 2014 when Act 46 was being debated, Vermont was top 5 in the country for 4th grade and 8th grade math and reading scores. Top 5 in the country. We had great outcomes. Our students were doing great. It was that we were just spending too much. Fast forward to today, we are still the second highest spending school system in the country. The only one that spends more than us is New York, but they pay their teachers a lot better than we do. So when you look at that and you say, okay, so we have the same financing challenges, same spending challenges, but now we're no longer ranked top 5 in the country. We are ranked 25 to 30 in the country, just on raw test scores.
Yep.
When you start factoring in the fact that our student demographics are quite different than the rest of the country.
Right.
We have a much lower poverty rate, a much lower rate of English language learners than other states. When you factor those in, we're actually maybe bottom 5 in the country.
Yeah, and my argument back is Vermont is maybe, among all of the countries, the United States is 25th, I think, of all of the countries, separate from the United States of America is 25th. So we're bragging about being 25th of 25th. I mean, that's way down the totem pole.
Way down the totem pole.
And that's really pathetic.
Yeah, and it's not for lack of investment, it's for a lack of accountability.
Right, there you go.
Because we have incredible investments, but we're not getting the return on that investment.
And we don't have a statewide standard for graduation.
Nope.
It's up to each school. That seems to me to be, or each supervisory unit. Which level is it?
Supervisory union.
That's ridiculous. This is a small state. You should have, so when you say I graduated in Vermont, people will know this is the level that you graduated at and you passed all of these benchmarks.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have an agreed upon graduation standard. We also don't even have an agreed upon set of metrics. Like, which metrics are we looking at to measure success? And are we even measuring success, or are we just going on vibes?
Right.
Like, and more often than
They've
not,
tried.
when you hear the, and I don't mean to pick on the unions, but when you hear the principals and the superintendents union and the teachers unions and all these groups come in, all these and when you ask them about accountability, you ask them about performance, they're like, we feel like we're doing great.
Yeah. Right. Oh, the feel. What is it? They had a thing about the happy quotient.
Yes.
That was a couple of years ago where they wanted to judge who's the happiest state.
Yeah.
Really.
I mean, there's some value in that. Yeah. But like when you come to an objective measure, you can't just measure off of vibes. Oh, we think we're doing great. Oh, students love their teachers. It's like, great, but are our students learning anything?
Right.
And the data says no, they're not.
Right.
And we've failed now a whole generation of students that have just missed out on having the quality of education that the generation before them had.
Absolutely.
And that's heartbreaking. And so we need to fix that. And we can look to other states that have fixed that problem. And you look at exactly on the opposite side of the story, the exact opposite story from ours, Mississippi, which you mentioned a minute ago, has been bottom of the barrel. They've been in the bottom 5 for decades. Like their student outcomes have always been way down, and they're the butt of jokes. It's like, oh, at least our education system is not like Mississippi's. Right. Well, guess what? In the same time frame that Vermont's education was declining, Mississippi was not investing more dollars. They're still spending about the same. Yeah. But they shifted focus. They said, okay, we're going to base all of our curriculum on, it's all going to be science-based learning. So it's all research tested. These are the best teaching methods that we know of today. So science-based learning and strong accountability, well, strong leadership, I would say. So the state Department of Education said, here is the level of performance, the expectations that we expect all of our schools to perform at. And then they put in an accountability framework. And the accountability framework went from the school boards to the principals, all the way down to the teachers. Right. Everyone is held accountable. So if your class is underperforming, there's an evaluation process to understand why is it underperforming, what additional resources, or is this just not the right teacher for this classroom? Right. And the same thing with the principal. If the school as a whole is failing, there's an accountability mechanism for that. And so within a decade, Mississippi has gone from the bottom 5 to the top 20.
That's great. Good for them.
We can learn something from that.
Yes.
And their cost per student, by the way, if we didn't need to like drive another nail into the coffin of spending does not guarantee outcomes, their cost per student for achieving better results for their students with a higher poverty rate than we have and a more diverse student population, they're spending half of what you spend.
Amazing.
For better outcomes.
Why don't we see that? Why are we so protective of what we have when it's not working?
Yeah. Well, it's because, the fear of change is strong. And, there's a lot of talk inside the State House about courage to do what's necessary. But what we're trying to do is make sure that that courage, that political capital, is not spent in the wrong places. Right. We saw that happen with Act 46, quite frankly. Act 46 spent the political capital, the will to change something, right? They never let a good crisis go to waste. Right. The will to change something, and they spent it in the wrong area.
How about helping the kids? Just a thought.
Yeah, they spent it, quite frankly, on helping superintendents because they felt like, the bigger school districts must be more efficient, and all these superintendents are complaining about how many school boards meetings they have to go to. They're saying consolidate districts. Let's do that. Well, guess what? We're right back in the same situation. It did not decrease spending. Right. On any objective measure, it did not decrease spending. Have no evidence to suggest that it increased outcomes. And here we are again, 10 years later, more than 10 years later, talking about how do we reduce spending? And already the conversation's turning from, okay, no, we can't actually cut spending. How do we bend the cost curve? How do we reduce future spending? It's like if you're going to have that conversation, just put the foundation formula in place and let that do the work.
There you
go. Why talk about governance at all if you're not going to cut spending?
The chair of education today, when we were talking about where do we fit in the scheme of things, he also talked that we are, something about documentation, he said documents, and you agreed with him. I think it meant how much work do we put people through with paperwork to and I told you if they're going to do any merging, the first thing they've got to do is go through and dump half of the forms and stuff they need, because I've lived through the DMV change. You don't need half of that stuff.
No, you don't need half of that stuff. And another change that was made around the same time as Act 46 was proficiency-based learning.
Oh yes.
And that's really increased the amount, what's involved in grading for teachers. It's not a straight letter grade anymore. You got an A or a B or a C or whatever. Now it's like, okay, this particular skill, are you meeting expectations or not meeting expectations? Okay. And they got to go through. In some cases, in some, when you're looking at applying that to graduation standards, in some places in the state, there's 17 skills that you get, this on. In other places, it's 50 skills that you get this on. And the amount of paperwork that's created for teachers is incredible. Right. And so you think about this, all that time that teachers are spending on grading or filling out paperwork or whatever is not time they're spending with kids in a classroom, teaching them or preparing to go into a classroom and teach kids. It's busy work, and it better make damn sure that that work is actually contributing to the outcome of the student. Right. Because if it's not...
I'll guarantee you half of it's not.
Yeah.
My experience at DMV blew my mind. do you ever use this information that you're collecting? No. Then why do you collect it? Well, because we always have. And I bet that's the same thing, that's what people do.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's called as bureaucracy.
there you go.
It was interesting because I did ROTC in college, and one of the first things they talked about, because the military is very in tune with this. They know bureaucracy is a problem, bureaucratic spending and just habits get in the way. So like this is sort of ingrained in the military from an efficiency standpoint, is like in military culture is like if you ask a question and someone says, oh, we've always done it that way, start asking questions.
Right.
Start asking more questions, because that is not a good answer. There has to be a reason we are doing it that way that contributes to the mission. And if it does not contribute to the mission, we don't have time or energy or resources to devote to it.
Yep.
And that's the way we should be looking at any endeavor we take on in state government, but particularly education, because the stakes could not be higher. I mean, we talk about the property tax burden, but it's also the future of our state. Right. It's the future of our kids. It's the future of our workforce. It's all of these things, and we can't afford to mess around with things that don't produce outcomes.
And I think we talked about this before. Every couple of years, we completely change the way our teachers are supposed to teach. No child left behind. That's just one of them. But when I was in the education, every couple of years, we were completely changing. I mean, at some point, just like with the weighted factors, you need to give it a couple of years to see if it's even working. So the poor teachers are standing on their heads trying to learn something new, and then a couple of years later, they're doing the same thing again. We have to make up our minds.
Yeah.
This is how we're going to do it, and stick to it. And you can make tweaks along the line, but give the kids and the teachers a break. Let them learn one thing.
Change is disruptive, and that's another reason why we looked at supervisory unions and combining those to achieve more scale, because districts, quite honestly, if you start reconfiguring districts, then it's much more disruptive to kids, because school boards are taking their focus off of what's going on in our buildings, what's going on with our students, to how are we fulfilling the statewide mandate that we've been given. And that's what happened with Act 46.
And people don't want it. I mean, you look at Calais. You and I have a mutual friend lives in Calais. The vote of whether they should merge or not went down in a blaze of glory. People want...
Yeah, they want local control.
They want local.
And there's no reason to take it away from them. If a school is performing or a district is performing well, like their students are thriving, and they're doing it at a reasonable cost, why change that?
Right.
Let's give them some more tools through the ESA to achieve cost savings. Today, we have 119 school districts and we have 52 supervisory unions. That's like about 170 different business units across the state.
And they also
in our
have to look at
education
the
space.
legislature. When I went into the department, I spent a weekend reading the job descriptions and statute of the principal, the superintendent, and the commissioner. There is very little authority in those words. They need to decide, the legislature, what you want each level to be doing and make it very clear what their role and responsibility is. And then you have to look at the documentation and see if that supports what they're trying to do. They need help too, because it's overwhelming.
Well, I think the mandate needs to change a little bit
Right.
for some of those roles, especially if we consolidate or replace supervisory unions with these larger ESAs. The role of the superintendent changes a little bit, and whether school districts want to continue to have chief executive function, or that chief executive kind of moves away to that ESA level. Either way, there's the role changes a little bit. So whoever is the chief executive of the ESA is focused on collaboration between districts. That's their focus. Like, okay, here are these services that we're required to provide, but based on the legislation. But what other areas can we find efficiencies in? Is there ways we can improve that service delivery? that we can coordinate so that kids who are coming out of high school or middle school are ready for CTE. Like, those are the types of things that superintendent or whoever the chief executive is for that ESA, that's their job. That's their role, is to help coordinate those things.
I agree. And it's even the commissioner or secretary now, the language doesn't give him anything. I remember when I was working with David Walt, the only thing he could do at that time was money. You withhold it or do something. But you didn't have any authority to do anything.
Vermont statute doesn't. Federal statute actually gives you quite a bit.
Oh, really? Well,
yeah.
we should look
so,
to that.
If you look at No Child Left Behind and ESA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, both of them give quite a lot of authority to the State Agency of Education.
Really?
And the Secretary of Education. So it's not in state statute that the Secretary has all this authority, but federal law actually does give them quite a lot of authority.
They apply it.
They don't. And that's one of the problems that we see in Vermont is, like I talked earlier about, there is a vacuum of leadership at the state level, both in terms of here is what we expect your students, how we expect your students to perform. Here are the key metrics that we're looking at, whether that is a standardized test grade or whatever. Here's the standard we expect. And here is the price range we expect you to be able to deliver it in. And that leadership at the state level is lacking. There's been a vacuum of leadership. And so if we don't even have that statewide set of expectations, so you can't even get to the second step of that, which is to hold people accountable to those
And do something
performance standards.
Right.
And this is something, even next door in Massachusetts, it's very clear. Like, here is the statewide standards. Here's what we expect your students to be able to achieve. And if you're not achieving that, the State Department of Education steps in and says, okay, you get a warning letter. You have 3 years to turn that trend around. If you don't turn it around, then we are going to put your school district in a receivership, and we're going to run it until things improve. And, just getting that letter alone is a wake-up call. Can you imagine as a school board member to get that letter from the agency and be like, okay, guys, we've got to do something here.
Shape up.
Yeah, shape up or ship out. And that's the type of accountability we're talking about. It's worked in Massachusetts, it's working in Mississippi, and we need that here as well.
I hope they pay attention then. I know one year where I live in Berlin, we looked at every dime because they asked us to cut as much, and we had a streamlined, lean budget, and everything went up because it was blended in with everybody else, and that was hard to explain to the citizens of my town.
Yeah.
Why we worked really hard to look at every dollar. And
we
then,
level funded, but our property
and then
taxes still went up, and that's a casualty of our current funding formula, and that is, quite frankly, why we've seen such large spending increases over the last several decades, because if my property taxes are going up 5% anyway, like as a school board, the property taxes are going up 5% anyway. We could cut, like we could level fund our budget. It's still going up 5%.
Exactly.
So we may as well get something for that.
Right. There you go. I don't want to face that. That was a bad town meeting day that year.
Yeah.
Ooh. And then they told us we were a gold town. What?
Yeah.
Anyway.
In what universe is Berlin
exactly.
a
So
gold
Ben,
town?
thank you very much for joining us, joining me tonight.
Pat.
It was very informative, and we'll have you back as this progresses, because this is for the kids, and it's important, and for us property owners for sure. Thank you very much. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next week. In the meantime, this is Pat McDonald, and Ben Kinsley, your hosts for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites.